Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. My name is Kai. I also did my capstone on the coffee industry, and I have a lot to cover, so I'll just get started. I'm going to go kind of fast. I wanted to start with this statistic here. This is from a 2015 paper, a climate modeling paper. Climate change will reduce the global area suitable for growing coffee by 50%. And this is by the year 2050, and this is actually under a relatively conservative emission scenario, which we're surpassing right now. And this has, obviously huge implications. At least 100 million people all over the world depend on coffee for their livelihoods. That doesn't even include the rest of us who arguably depend on coffee for our livelihoods. So this raises a lot of questions. Okay, what exactly does this mean? How is climate change negatively impacting coffee? What are sources of possible vulnerability and resilience in the supply chain, and what can we do about it? And while this is a very broad, global problem, as we've seen, the solutions will vary from location to location. So it's helpful to examine these questions with a case study. So, a case study can give us a more detailed picture of what is actually happening. In my case, I went to Kerala in southwest India, and I studied the coffee industry there. So, we'll talk about this more later, but right now I want to introduce this story in this particular region as one of competing incentives that are often antagonistic to each other, and we'll see where that leads us later. Start from the top, what is coffee? This is, when you Google image coffee, this is the first few hundred pictures that show up. It's just kind of a, snarky way of addressing our kind of myopic view on where we get our resources. This actually isn't coffee. This is a beverage made from coffee. This is coffee. It's a plant. It's actually a genus of plants. There are 124 known species. All the coffee that is cultivated by humans for mass production comes from 2 species. There's a picture of it here. And what we know of as a coffee bean is actually the seed that is inside this fruit that you can see on the left. So where does coffee come from? It comes from farmers. I think it's just important to stress again that, every time you drink a cup of coffee, someone in the world has, grown those beans and depend on this industry for their livelihood. So moving right along, this is just a chart of global coffee prices over time. You can see it fluctuates wildly, from 50 cents a pound to over $3 a pound. And, basically there are a lot of different reasons for these price changes, but the cost of production isn't really one of them. The farmers actually don't have a lot of power in determining the prices, and sometimes even the cost of coffee dips below the cost of production. So, that seems crazy. How is that even possible? If farmers aren't controlling the prices, who is? This is my favorite slide in this presentation. I'm going to just say a statistic. I'll try to say it slowly. 10 years ago, the top 10 biggest coffee companies controlled 35% of the global coffee market. Okay, so 10 years ago, 10 companies, about a third of the market. Today, 3 companies control over 55% of the global coffee market. So this is an enormous company. This isn't even the biggest one. The biggest one is Nestle. This is the second biggest one. It's called JAB Holding Company. You may have never heard of it. I'd never heard of it when I started this project, and yet they own Peet's Coffee. They own Caribou, if you're from the Midwest. They own Keurig and K-Cups, Einstein Bros, Noah's. They've also recently acquired Illy. And that's just in the coffee sector. So other brands that this company owns include Dr. Pepper, Snapple, Panera, and Krispy Kreme, just to name a few. So what I'm trying to, get at here is this idea of buyer-driven supply chains. So on the one hand, you have this enormous multinational corporations that are in, purchasing and redistributing the primary commodities like coffee. On the other hand, the producers are, millions of farmers all over the world. A lot of them only have 1 or 2 acres of land at most, and it's just really difficult for that many people to organize themselves and exercise any power, any bargaining power over these large companies. In addition, deregulated markets in recent years, because of global neoliberalism, have removed some of the few protections that have existed for farmers historically. And in addition to that, high barriers to entry. It's really difficult for a single farmer or even a neighborhood of farmers to get together and pool their money and purchase a transnational shipping container or build their own coffee mill. Prices in coffee and a lot of these primary commodities are determined more by futures contracts, speculation, a lot of Wall Street shenanigans that I don't have time to get into right now. But I will talk about Kerala, where I went for my project and how it's affecting that region. So Kerala is really interesting. It's in southwest India. I chose this region for a bunch of reasons. One of them is there was this lovely institute that was willing to host me. We'll talk more about them later. But just in general, it's a really interesting place geographically. First of all, it grows 20% of India's coffee, so it is a major coffee producing region. It's listed as one of the top 10 most important biodiversity hotspots in the world, so huge numbers of native species that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And on top of that, it has a human population of over 35 million. For reference, that's almost the population of California. In terms of square miles, this state is smaller than San Bernardino County. So amazingly huge human population in one of the richest rainforests in the world, and also a lot of coffee. And this is what's happening to the coffee industry there. So on the left, you can see kind of a traditional polyculture system that people in India have been using to produce their crops for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You can see in this picture there are banana trees and mango and jackfruit, other fruit trees that form this canopy layer. And when coffee was first introduced to India during British colonial times, everyone back then was growing coffee Arabica. Up until recently, that was the only cultivated species of coffee. This is the higher quality of the two species. It prefers shade, so it kind of seamlessly integrated into this traditional agriculture system. So you can see in this picture, they're growing coffee in the understory, and even on the ground below that, they grow turmeric, ginger, clove, all sorts of stuff. On the other hand, you see what has been recently happening in the past couple decades. Over 80% of the coffee grown in Wayanad in Kerala, where I went, have shifted to this monoculture system. So this is the second species. This is Robusta. This is lower quality beans, usually used for instant coffee, for flavored coffee, like that kind of stuff. And it prefers full sun. So this huge demand for producing a single commodity as cheaply as possible has caused most of the coffee in this region to switch to this system. So I went there to see it for myself. I was hosted by this lovely institution called the Swaminathan Research Foundation. This is Dr. Swaminathan himself. He's a very famous agriculture scientist focused on kind of sustainable solutions to agriculture. And I wish I had more time to talk about all the lovely work they do. They have native plant nurseries. They do, demonstration plots. They do sustainability workshops, and they have a science library that people actually use. But most importantly for my project, they put me in touch with farmers, and I got to actually speak to farmers. So, I'm studying climate change, I'm studying coffee, and I got to talk to them and ask them questions like, what are the most important seasons, for the coffee production system here, when is the rainfall most important, those kinds of things. And I really used that experience to guide my research questions to make them, relevant. So I'm studying climate change. A little bit of background on climate in this area. It experiences a typical South Indian monsoon climate. Most of the rainfall they get, over half of the rainfall during the monsoon season, which is in the summer, June to September. And climate modeling projections have indicated that this region overall will get hotter and drier. This kind of monsoon system will be breaking down. Less predictable rainfall in the future. But again, there are a lot of microclimates in this region. There are mountains and rain shadows and tropical forests and open valleys. So it's really important to look at this from a more local perspective. So this is what I spent the majority of my time doing in my capstone. I got weather data from a local research station in the region that I visited, and I made a lot of graphs, and I analyzed a lot of data. And I'm not going to share all of it with you today, but just a few. This is the total precipitation during the monsoon season. It was found to be decreasing on average between 6 and 7 millimeters per year since 1984 when data collection began. The average summer temperatures have been increasing, especially in June, which is a really important time of the year because it's when the monsoon season starts and it begins the growing season for a lot of crops. And this is showing a delayed monsoon onset. So on average, the first day with a significant amount of rainfall, about an inch, has been delayed about a day every 5 years. So just a quick recap, less rainfall during monsoon months, hotter summers, and delayed monsoon onset. I want to heavily caveat this by saying, this is all data from one specific research station, so, you can't really extrapolate this out to the broader region without doing further research. But in general, it does seem like this area, at least, is fitting with the broader regional projections for the climate in this area. So hotter and drier, what that could be bad for agriculture, what, can be done about it. These are, surprise the methods that, people have been using to grow food in India for thousands of years are more sustainable and more resilient to climate change than the so-called modern agriculture. So, the shade-grown beans are higher quality, better for consumers. The shade layer increases resistance to heat and drought. Having diverse crop systems ensures that, in unpredictable weather, if one crop fails, another one, will help the farmers get by. And the soil health is better, which is better for long-term productivity, and it's also better for the ecosystem in general. A lot of studies have shown that these integrated polyculture systems have orders of magnitude higher natural wildlife biodiversity, in addition to sequestering soil carbon at the same rate as a patch of native rainforest. On the other hand, the Robusta coffee is slightly cheaper, at least for now, and so this is the only incentive that really matters in our current economic structure, and that's why over 80% of the agriculture in this region has converted to this system with no signs of slowing down. So I just wanted to conclude on a personal note. This picture on the left is me and my cousin in Maui. I grew up there when I was younger, and I just loved corals and fish and checking out whatever I was checking out in that picture. Since that photo was taken, over 90% of the coral in that beach and surrounding beaches has disappeared. My first job was as a frog biologist in Yosemite. I worked there for 5 years, and over the course of working there, I witnessed over 95% of the populations in Yosemite of the frogs die. And since I moved here, I've been a barista for 5 years, and so of course my question is, is coffee next? And it sounds crazy to say that coffee could be, prohibitively expensive 50 years from now. But equally shocking, 20 years ago would say that, a quarter of the coral on the planet would be gone, or that all of the frogs in Yosemite would be gone, and yet here we are. So, half of the suitable land area by 2050, that's of the cultivated coffee. In addition, a recent study just came out saying over 60% of the wild species of coffee, those 124 species, are under threat of extinction due to climate change and habitat loss. And we don't even really know that much about those species yet. They're very understudied. So I just want to end with this. This is a quote from a farmer that I heard when I was there visiting. He said, it's an ancient saying here, if your stomach is not full, you cannot hear. The farmers there know, they know better than I do, they live their whole lives there, that this system on the left is better for the long-term, viability of life there. Than the modern monoculture, and yet they make the switch anyway because the prices of coffee are sometimes so cheap they have to make ends meet, and when it's between feeding their children and cutting down the trees, they're going to choose their children. So here on this side of the world, our stomachs are full for the most part. We do have a little more power to choose, so consumer consciousness is really important. Buying fair trade coffee is okay. Buying direct trade coffee is even better. I'm happy to talk more about that later. I don't have time right now. But I just want to end with saying that these solutions of consumer consciousness will mostly be triage solutions until we address the larger problems of our economic incentives which are, always prioritize. Short-term profits are always prioritized over long-term sustainability, producing commodities, primary commodities and raw materials as cheaply as possible, regardless of other costs. Obviously, it has these enormous externalized impacts, and capitalism is fundamentally based on infinite growth, which is just not feasible on a finite planet that we live in. So my final remark would be to say that, in the course of my research, I have realized that we have to face a choice between admitting that our levels of resource consumption that we define and strive for as, success in a modern society just fundamentally come at the expense of most other people on the planet and most other species of life on the planet, including all future generations. So that's one choice. We can just admit that that is what we're doing, or we can admit that there's a need to fundamentally redefine what an affluent and successful society looks like in the 21st century. And with that, I'll open up the floor to questions. Cool, thanks.
So you talked about a lot of coffee companies that aren't doing this so well. Do you know of any examples that are?
Yeah, there's been a very pretty popular recent wave of a thing called direct trade coffee businesses, which actually will buy their beans directly from farmers, and they set up, long-term relationships with these farmers, and they'll help them invest up front with capital investments to improve their practices and buy their beans. I work currently for Bird Rock Coffee Roasters. They were one of the pioneers doing this. There are a bunch, especially in Southern California, because it's very trendy. Modern Times, Global Coffee Trading. There are a whole bunch. If you just Google search direct trade coffee. Fair trade coffee is okay too. But they're a much more opaque organization, and there's been a lot of contention around them recently about how well they monitor a lot of their so-called fair trade farms. So it's still better, but it's not quite as good as buying directly from farmers. Cool. Thank you.